This is PowerPoint Lecture 2.2, Part C, or Part 3. This is the third part of the Republican era's discussion. And we start off here, we're dealing with the era of good feelings and the expansion of national government power during that period. And we have here three critical cases from the Supreme Court that establish both the supremacy of the national government over state governments and the establishment of the national court or Supreme Court over any lesser jurisdiction. The first of them is Fletcher v. Peck, and in an attempt to avoid the very drawn-out particulars of the case, there was a corruption case in the state of Georgia. The state of Georgia decided to sell off a bunch of land, which was actually Indian land, called the Yazoo lands, which is modern-day Alabama and Mississippi. And they tried to sell it all off for cheap, and a bunch of the legislators to pass the law had taken bribes by the potential purchasers to buy this cheap land, which they promptly did. Only one of the legislators voted against it. They bought the cheap land, and then later on they said, well, corruption charges came up and the whole scandal came out, and they said, okay, well, as a result of this being the product of corruption, it needs to be thrown out, and all the people that purchased the land goes back up for sale because their purchase was illegal. And the Supreme Court is going to rule that we can't do that, even though the law was created under dubious circumstances. It is nonetheless the law. And under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution is going to be pivotal in the first two of these cases. It deals with property right and contracts. Okay? A state, it is ruled in Fletcher versus Peck that a state cannot nullify property rights as they exist under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, which places the Constitution, the significance of this, of course, is that it places the Constitution above state law. When the Georgia legislature says, well, we're going to null and void that law because it was obtained through dubious purposes and therefore the property rights don't exist, the Supreme Court says, no, the property rights do exist, even if the law was created under corruption. Nonetheless, property rights are property rights, and they have to be upheld. Dartmouth versus Woodward is largely the same case. It's the same idea. The trustees of Dartmouth College is a private institution. It was granted privacy. It was granted its charter back before the Revolution. And the Supreme Court will rule that the Revolution does not null and void prior existing property rights. And because it's a private institution, under the control of its trustees, they're free to appoint whatever president they see fit. Kind of appropriate given Robert Morris's recent announcement of a new president. And when the trustees, in this case, when the trustees of Dartmouth appoint a new president, the state tries to step in and claim that Dartmouth, because it is an institution of education, serves the public interest and is therefore in the public domain, and therefore is subject to the state's authority. The Supreme Court says no, the Charter grants them property rights under Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, and therefore they're free to do as they see fit. And so both of those, Fletcher v. Peck and Dartmouth v. Woodward, both reinforce and restate the supremacy of property right as it exists in the U.S. Constitution, and both say that state governments cannot negate these rights. Which is an expansion of national government. And then finally, and perhaps the most famous and most pivotal of them, we have McCulloch v. Maryland. As I said last time, in 1816, they charter a new national bank. Well, the state of Maryland decides under the charter of the new national bank, the national bank is free to open offices wherever it sees fit. The state of Maryland says, no, we won't let you open an office of the National Bank in Maryland. Maryland disagreeing with the constitutionality of a national bank in the first place. They say, no, we won't let you open the office. McCulloch is supposed to be the guy in charge of the national government's bank in Maryland. And so it's McCulloch versus the state of Maryland. Maryland refuses to allow him to open the bank, and the Supreme Court will rule that one, the Constitution, the national government, the federal government, is free to charter a new national bank under the conditions and can in fact open an office anywhere, which stipulates, okay, which reinforces and rules that although the Constitution, and we've talked about this before, although the Constitution does not specifically and explicitly grant the right to charter a national bank, okay, to the federal government may do anything that the Constitution does not forbid it from doing. Okay, and so we're back to the original debate between Hamilton and Madison. And remember, Hamilton's position was that under Article 1, Section 10, Congress can make any laws necessary and proper. And Madison countered with no, under the 10th Amendment, anything not explicitly given to the national government is reserved to the state governments. Okay, in this case, the chartering of a bank. And so the Supreme Court rules for a very loose interpretation of the Constitution and an expansion both of the Constitution and of the authority of the national government by saying, no, the Constitution does not expressly forbid Congress or the national government from engaging a new national bank, and therefore it's legitimate, and Maryland has to go along with it because the national government is supreme. The state governments are subordinate. And so we have three, in a relatively rapid period of time, pivotal Supreme Court cases that establish the supremacy of the Constitution, the supremacy of the national government, and the subordination of the states. In the foreign policy realm, we have additional expansions. And remember, this is in the wake of the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 will be the last time that Britain and the United States take up arms against each other. We'll originally have this Rush-Bagot Agreement, which eliminates Great Lakes fleets. This gives the United States supremacy over the Great Lakes. The Anglo-American Accord will be signed in 1818, which calls for a resolution of disputes through peaceful means and increase in cooperation between Britain and the United States. It calls for joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. The Oregon Territory is a massive territory out west, just north of the Louisiana Purchase. It would include what is today, let's see, the Dakotas, Montana, Washington, Oregon, and all of Western Canada. That's considered the Oregon Territory. And they'll put a border at the 49th parallel. And there will be a dispute that comes up about this in the 1840s that will be resolved peacefully just around the time of the Mexican War. But at any rate, the 49th parallel, which will divide the Canadian border from the American border, and which is a boundary that exists to this day. And then finally, the U.S. will be granted trade rights off the coast of Canada, which, of course, they originally negotiated in the Treaty of Paris. Then we have the First Seminole Indian War. The Seminoles were in Florida, and they existed largely as an autonomous unit. Now, we want to remember that at this time, officially Spain controls Florida, though the United States claims it. And in what the Seminole Nation had been doing, or at least the United States charged the Seminole Nation was doing this with some substantial evidence to support it, they were giving safe haven to runaway slaves from Georgia. Okay, the slaves would run south, enter into Spanish Florida, and be given safe haven by the Seminoles. Add to that the fact that the Spanish themselves for reasons that we've talked about before, were unable to project sufficient force into the Americas. They were rapidly losing control and will, in fact, lose control of their American territories in the 1820s. Um, uh, which we'll deal with. Actually, we'll deal with that when we deal with Texas later on. Um, but for right now, as a result, the Seminoles were an autonomous actor. The Spanish were incapable of defending Florida, and so in a rather bold move by Andrew Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson will assemble uh, a force of volunteers, a militia of volunteers, and without sanctioning of the U.S. government, invade Florida, both against the Spanish and against the Seminoles, which will initiate the First Seminole War. And it is a guerrilla war. Jackson, we remember, it makes his name by being an Indian fighter, so to speak, and he will prove that here. Um, and it will be a relatively inconclusive war. The United States will ultimately have to withdraw its forces from Florida, um, and ultimately negotiate with Spain and receive Florida. And then finally we have so it's relatively inconclusive, but it just shows the brashness of Jackson more than anything else. And then we have the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, which sets the border with Spain in North America, and that's what grants the U.S. Florida. As I said, that there's a negotiated settlement to this Florida dispute a year later. This is after March of 18. Jackson will be forced to withdraw from Florida, but in the Transcontinental Treaty, it'll set the border with Spain and actually set it at the Red River in Louisiana, and then a parallel will be drawn across North America from the Red River in northern Louisiana, separating what is then the Louisiana Territory from Spanish-controlled America, which, as I said, in the 1820s, they'll lose control of all of that, and grants the United States Florida. We then will have the first enunciated foreign policy statement in U.S. history. And we want to look at the provisions. The Monroe Doctrine, of course, is very famous. This is under President James Monroe, 1823. It's very famous. What it's famous for is the first clause. The first clause is that the Western Hemisphere is closed to European colonization. This is a statement by the United States that, in its view, in the view of the United States, the Western Hemisphere is a United States sphere of influence. This will ultimately lay the groundwork for the Roosevelt Corollary, which is something we cover in U.S. history too, in 1903, in which Roosevelt will, as a corollary to this, stipulate that the United States feels free to use force to protect its interests in the Americas, and this will initiate a series of interventions in the Central and South American regions. And then the second clause is at least as important, and it is drawn directly as a result of both the 1790s and the first decade of the 19th century. During that period, as we saw in our discussion, the United States is used as a cat's paw by both Britain and France. Both Britain and France court the United States to try to get them involved in the Napoleonic conflicts. The result of this ultimately is the War of 1812. So the Monroe Doctrine stipulates that the United States proclaims neutrality in all inter-European disputes, all European affairs. The United States is going to stay clear of them. And in a larger sense, okay, what this is going to do is allow the United States to focus its attention on conquering North America. They no longer have to worry about being, the United States that is, has to worry about being distracted by European affairs. They're not going to pay any attention to them. Leave the Europeans to the Europeans. And this will last ultimately until the First World War. Woodrow Wilson will go against that in the First World War, but this will last till the First World War. And instead, the United States is going to concentrate its resources and efforts in what it refers to as manifest destiny, which we've talked about before, and spreading across the continent. as the era of good feelings progresses, and as this wave of nationalism rises, the United States is going to experience the first economic crisis since the revolution. We talked at great length of the economic crisis in the post-revolutionary period with inflation and the difficulty between debtors and creditors, etc., etc. And we talked about that before. This is going to be the first, now that the United States is this independent nation and is up and running. And we want to look at what causes it, because it's going to set up a recurring theme in U.S. history. It's going to happen now, although it only happens briefly because it's not very severe. It will happen again in 1837. It happens again in the 1850s. It happens again in the 1890s. It will happen again in the 1930s, and it happens again in 2008. And it's a basic idea. Now, let's look at the causes. Okay? The Napoleonic conflict takes place in Europe. This devastates European productivity, particularly in their textile industry. In an effort to rebuild their industry, the demand for cotton from the South increases. Okay, they need to repair and replenish all of the wartime losses from the Napoleonic conflicts. And for Britain, to a lesser degree, the War of 1812 as well. And so demand for Southern cotton is going to spike. And of course, if demand for Southern cotton spikes, the price of Southern cotton is going to go up. Okay? That's one part of it. Okay? And as a result of the spiking in demand for Southern cotton production is going to increase. Okay? The cotton producers in the South are going to ratchet up production, okay, and expand their means of production to make up for this increase in demand from Europe. Now, the way they're going to do that is they're going to buy more land, and they're going to buy more capital equipment, okay, which is going to put them in debt to the banks. Okay, they're going to borrow money to do that. All right, put that. The second is we've now purchased the Louisiana Territory. Okay, between that and we talked about Fletcher versus Peck and the expansion westward in the Southwest, especially from Georgia to the Mississippi River. Okay, so you have a massive westward expansion going up to the Mississippi and then beyond the Mississippi. Well, all of that land is going to be purchased, and to purchase it, people are going to borrow money from banks. And so between the expansion of Southern cotton production and the westward expansion of land, and the two things, of course, are interrelated. Part of that expansion of production of cotton in the South is the result of the westward expansion and the land expansion. And so between those two things, you're going to put a strain on the banking system. And then you have, in addition to this, you have a residual problem because of the inflation that comes from the War of 1812. And I say there it's a residual problem prior to the rechartering of the National Bank and control of the supply of money by the national government. Okay, so you have an overissuance of money. So you have over-borrowing and over-lending. At the same time, you have the value of money going down, and so the money that's being paid back is worth less because of the inflation, similar to what happened after the Revolution. All right. The result of all this, because of the increased demand for cotton in Europe, cotton prices just about double. Okay. Because of the increased demand for land and the push westward and the expansion of Southern cotton production, land prices become inflated. This is also caused by the residual problem of money losing its value because of the inflation. Okay, the Western land debt you see there ultimately reached $21 million. Okay, this places a strain on the banking system itself. And just as this strain is coming up, the National Bank comes in and starts to curtail the supply of money. The onset of the crisis, okay, and this is really going to be like the first depression in U.S. history. It doesn't last for very long. It's little more than a recession. but still, it's going to send ripples through the economic system. By 1818, the rebuilding, the reconstruction after the Napoleonic conflicts has come to an end, and so the demand for Southern cotton is going to precipitously drop. Okay, now what does this do? As the demand for cotton drops, the price of cotton will drop as well. This means that the cotton producers who had expanded their production on borrowed money to meet this increased demand are no longer making as much money, and they can no longer afford to pay the banks back for the loans that they'd received. Okay? This is what creates the credit contraction in the U.S. And so, all in all of this creates a strain on the banking system. Now, to explain this still further, I have this little sketch that I've drawn of the basic credit system and the way it works in the United States. We're going to see this as a recurring theme through U.S. history, so we want to understand what it is. Let me flash up my handy-dandy laser pointer so I can point to things. All right. Think of money, okay, as fluid, and think of the banks as a large reservoir of money. And so we have these bank reserves. Think of it as fluid in a tank, as water in a tank. We have these bank reserves. Well, the banks lend out this money. They open this valve right here and lend money out, okay? Money out from banks. Who are they lending it to at this point? They're lending it to land speculators. They're lending it to Southern cotton producers, okay? Those guys then, okay, public sector, they're also, that's the other thing that I didn't mention before, is that they're also lending money, although I kind of hint at it, they're also lending money to states for the development of infrastructure. Remember, the Erie Canal is being built at this time. There's going to be a railroad expansion. There's going to be an expansion of steamboats, etc. Okay, so you're lending out this money to land speculation, to cotton production, to infrastructure development. Okay, those guys then pay the money back. Okay, so the water, which is the money, comes out of the tank. And then as they pay this back, they dump the water back into the tank. And what you hope is that the money lent out is equal to the money that's paid back, so that this level stays generally level. Okay, so that the level of bank reserves stays effectively level. Okay, but as a result of all the land speculation and increase in cotton production, infrastructure development, there's this idea of subsidizing manufacturing. Okay, there's just a massive expansion during this era of good feelings of productivity in the United States, and to finance that, you need capital development, and to finance that capital development, you need to borrow money, and so more money is being lent out than is being paid back. But still, you're not in bad shape so long as people are paying back the money. But when the demand for cotton collapses in Europe, and therefore the income to the cotton producers collapses, they're no longer able to pay off the banks. And so this level of water in the tank, so to speak, okay, to stretch the metaphor, drops down, being lent out, and doesn't get refilled. We're going to see this again and again through American history. And just briefly to reference this is largely what happens in the 2008 banking crisis. Okay, beginning in the early 1990s, the banks start lending out more and more money at very low interest rates for any variety of reasons. Most notably in the crisis of 2008, mortgages. As long as the people are paying the money back, no crisis exists. But when the people are no longer able to pay back those banks, then the crisis hits, because all of a sudden bank reserves drain to a dangerously low level. That's the basis of the credit system. That's basically how credit works. So whenever I reference this, this is what we're going to reference, is the idea of lending money out from banks, bringing money back into banks through repayment. It's the repayment part of it that is going to put the United States in, so to speak, hot water in terms of their credit system. It's going to happen again in 1837. It's going to happen again in the 1890s and again in the 1930s. And then, of course, again, as I just referenced, in 2008. On to the Missouri Compromise. Okay, a crisis begins to build. And I continually reiterate this point. One of the unfortunate things, history is written by the victors. One of the unfortunate things is that the war between the states, which ultimately is kind of the culmination of U.S. History 1, okay, often is degenerated into a question of slavery. This is a side issue to the overall conflict. What you have, and what we've seen already and will continue to see, you have two diametrically opposed points of view. You have one point of view that favors a limited national government, with the sovereignty of the states being supreme. You have another point of view that represents a stronger national government. We see this originally in the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists are eventually crystallizing into the Republican Party. Then you see within the Republican Party, and that's where we are now, a divide starting to come between these two groups. We saw this divide between Madison and Hamilton, okay, beginning with the chartering of the First National Bank. So there is this conflict inherent in the Constitution. It's because Madison, when he wrote the Constitution, never clearly defined the borders, the boundaries of sovereignty between the states and the national government. Okay, well, as time has gone on, the slave states become synonymous with the states advocating states' rights. Okay, and the problem is that Missouri plans on coming in as a slave state. Missouri also, of course, represents the position of a limited national government. This presents a problem, because if Missouri comes in as a slave state, and therefore also as an anti-national government state, that tips the balance in the U.S. Senate. Not so much in the U.S. House of Representatives, okay, because Missouri at that time doesn't have very much of a population. So not so much in the U.S. House, but definitely in the U.S. Senate, will tilt the balance in favor of the states' rights position against the national government. Well, this is at a period, remember, this is after the War of 1812. This is the end of the era of good feelings, the rise in nationalism, the rise in the power of the national government that we've been looking at really throughout this period. Okay, and so the nationalists, those who favor a strong national government, want to prevent this from happening. Okay, because in addition to Missouri, and you see this right here, you have new states coming up: Kentucky, Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. All of those are slave states. All of those advocate limited national government and strong central government. Okay, and so if Missouri enters, it's going to destroy the balance of power in the Senate and tilt it towards the states' rights. Okay, Monroe, for his part, who we mentioned only in the Monroe Doctrine, is elected in 1816 on a strong nationalist position. Okay, and we haven't really talked about this. We'll get to this at the end of this part 3. But we're already starting to see a division within the Republican Party. As mentioned originally in Part A of 2.2, Jefferson comes into office in favor of a limited national government, espousing the anti-federalist viewpoint and states' rights. But what we saw with Jefferson is, to an unprecedented level, he not only expanded the power of the national government, but expanded the power of the presidency, principally with the Louisiana Purchase. The Embargo Act expanded the power of the national government, etc. Well, when Madison comes in, Madison is elected after Jefferson as a response to this. Madison represents the traditional liberal view of the Republicans. And that kind of, I may as well rest here just for a moment and define what we mean by liberalism. For some bizarre reason, somewhere along the line, probably in the 1930s, liberal came to mean someone who favors government intervention and social welfare and things like that. What we mean here is the classical term of liberal. It stems from the term liberty. A classic liberal believes in individual freedom and limited government power. That's the kind of classical origins of the term liberal. All right. Madison comes in on that classical liberal position of a limited national government. And we saw through his administration, among other things, refusing to recharter a national bank, that he maintains the purity of the Republican viewpoint of states' rights and a limited national government. Well, as a counterpoise to that, Monroe is going to rise up, very strongly favoring a strong national government. And so he'll come in 1816, and so the Missouri Compromise, and really the Monroe Doctrine, is really a statement of that strong national government. And all those Supreme Court cases, not Fletcher v. Peck, but the other two, Dartmouth versus Woodward and McCulloch v. Maryland, will be under Monroe's administration. Okay, and so Monroe is gonna pull in, during this era of good feelings, strong national patriotism, stronger national government. Monroe's going to ride those shirt tails in. And so we initiate, as we've seen already, this period of strong national government of the United States. He'll run on this platform. And what we're going to see in the Missouri Compromise here in just a second is that the Missouri Compromise is going to raise the supremacy of the national government to an unprecedented level. Okay? Now, the compromise, the original compromise, comes from James Talmadge. And the plan you see here, we ban all new slave states and eventual emancipation for the existing slaves in exchange for Missouri being allowed into the as a state. Okay? This is deemed unconstitutional. And we want to reiterate this. We want to highlight this again. Okay, and this is what we keep in the back of our minds as we go through not only the Missouri Compromise, but as we lead up towards the war between the states. We looked in our discussion of the Articles of Confederation. We saw in the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787 the conditions that are necessary for a state to become a state. Probably better said, a territory to become a state. You have to have, what was it? A governor, 3 judges, and 60,000 people. Once you get 60,000 people, you're free to apply for statehood and write your own constitution. Nowhere in there does it say, okay, that you can only become a state if the remaining states allow you to be. This is not, after all, the National Football League. The National Football League is based on the idea that the only way somebody gets a new franchise is if the other owners vote them in. Okay? Neither does it stipulate that the national government can dictate or say anything about what's in that Constitution. All right? And so as a result of Talmadge's plan, the southern states again will threaten to secede. And it's not only because of the issue of slavery. We have a larger issue here. Under what stretch of the imagination can the national government presume to dictate or have any voice whatsoever in what a state puts in its constitution? Okay? This is a violation of state sovereignty. So we have this larger issue. On to the field of play will come one of the United States' truly, truly evil, demonic personalities, Henry Clay. You know, it's funny, Henry Clay used to be one of my heroes, he and Alexander Hamilton both, but that was when I was in high school. And as I went to college and began to learn more and more and more about them, I came to despise both of them with a white-hot venomous hatred, the white-hot intensity of 1,000 suns. Well, here comes Henry Clay. This won't be the last time we hear about Henry Clay. Henry Clay is going to work out a compromise. Missouri will enter the Union as a slave state. In exchange, Maine, the northeastern part of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, Maine, which is now an independent territory, will enter the Union as a free state. Maine is in New England. New England is the old stronghold of the Federalist Party. So New England favors a strong national government. Maine, therefore, will favor a strong national government. Missouri represents the states' rights position. So by letting Missouri in and Maine in at the same time, you maintain this balance of power in the U.S. Senate. With me? Okay, understand? Furthermore, there will be no slavery in the Louisiana Purchase north of the northern border of Missouri, which is the 36 degrees 30 minutes. Okay, that 36-30 parallel will be drawn across the Louisiana Territory. And all of the states north, all of the territories north of that line will not be permitted to have slavery in their constitution. And again, I reiterate the significance of this. It has very little to do with slavery itself. The significant issue has nothing to do with slavery. The significant issue has to do with states' rights versus the sovereignty of the national government. Under the Northwest Land Ordinance of 1787, the national government is not given the authority to dictate what states can and cannot do in their constitutions. The Missouri Compromise will change that. As a result, in the 1850s, the Missouri Compromise will be thrown out because it's going to be deemed as unconstitutional. Okay? This expands the power of the national government. Remember, I'll make reference here and remember the decision in McCulloch v. Maryland. If it's not explicitly forbidden to the national government in the Constitution, then the national government can do it. Well, while the Northwest Land Ordinance does not give the national government the right to dictate what states can have in their constitution, neither does it explicitly deny them the right to do it. And so they're going to play on that idea. And so from that point forward, the national government will be able to intervene and have influence over what states put in their constitution. We are now going to see another thing. I've mentioned it before. We're going to see this as a recurring theme, and it really gets to the study of political science on a more abstract or theoretical level in the United States. What we've seen before and what we're going to see again is one of the things that destroys a political party. We talked about it with the Federalists. One of the principal things that destroyed the party was a division within the party. We saw it first between Hamilton and Madison. Okay, and then Adams and Hamilton had a falling out over foreign policy, and that divided the Federalist Party, which in and of itself was not enough. The Federalist Party also alienated its base of support. Okay, but again, that wasn't enough to kill off the party. What was necessary is an alternative political party to rise up, to crystallize and mobilize its resources, which of course was in the guise of Thomas Jefferson and the Republican Party. Well, now we're going to see the same thing happen to the Republicans. Okay, there is a division. We have represented by James Monroe and this nationalist position of the Republicans versus the old liberal Republicans best represented by Madison. So there's your party division. One favoring a stronger national government, almost quasi-federalist. The other favoring a limited national government, which was the original platform of the Republican Party. Okay? This division is going to be exacerbated by these twin crises that come up in Missouri and the Panic of 1819. Okay, the Panic of 1819 is largely going to be attributed to the lack of national government control over the monetary system. Okay, because most of the precipitory causes of it come prior to the chartering of another national bank. The problem with that is that at that time, there is really no successor to the Monroe administration. There's not, in other words, there's not an alternative to the Republican Party. No alternative political viewpoint has crystallized, okay, around the issues and has mobilized its resources. Now that's going to change, okay? But by the time of the 1824 election, it's really only a fledgling party. It really doesn't have sufficient political collateral to unseat the Republicans. Okay. Now, in addition, we want to remember as kind of a backdrop to this, which I don't have on this slide, but nonetheless, we have it as a backdrop to this. The Republicans have also alienated a large portion of their base. Remember, the Republican base of support came from the southern states, came from the states favoring limited national government. Well, first we have Jefferson, then we have Monroe, both of whom expand the power of the national government. We have those Supreme Court cases that expand the power of the national judiciary. We culminate this whole thing with the Missouri Compromise, which allows the national government now to determine what can and cannot go in state constitutions. And so these crises alienate the base of power of the Republican Party. Okay, so by 1824, that base is divided. This brings us to the contentious election of 1824. As I've said, there's no real clear successor to Monroe. The liberal view of the Republican Party, the limited states' rights view, is now a minority viewpoint for the Republicans. They are crystallizing around a new political party, okay, the Democratic Party. But that won't come up. That won't come up until the election of 1828. As I've said, they still haven't crystallized or mobilized their resources. They're still in the, so to speak, the Democratic Party is still in the planning stages. And it's actually going to be as a result of the election of 1824 that they finally crystallize, that they're finally able to mobilize themselves and move into a position where they can take the government. But in 1824, you still really only have one political party, but you have one political party that is very clearly divided into two factions. One faction favoring limited national government, the other faction favoring strong national government. Well, Andrew Jackson will lead the wing that favors a limited national government. He, after all, did on his own, without sanctioning of the national government, invade Florida. Okay. On the other side, you have John Quincy Adams, okay, the nephew of John Adams, who favors a strong national government, and his political party will really be referred to as the National Republicans, and their time in the sun is very brief and is corrupt, and we'll get into why that is. Okay, in the election of 1824. And you see the results here. You can't really see, because I didn't do this in color, you can't really see who votes for who, but that's not important. What's important is this, okay? We see that liberal wing of the party, represented by Andrew Jackson, limited national government, strong states' rights, wins a plurality of the votes, not a majority. Plurality means the most. Majority means greater than 50%. Okay, so he wins 43% of the popular vote and 38% of the electoral vote, which is not sufficient. To become president, you have to have a majority of the electoral votes. Adams, for his part, doesn't win a majority either. That means, like the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson was elected, the decision goes to the House of Representatives. This is where the corruption comes in. Henry Clay is the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He makes a backroom deal with John Quincy Adams. He says, look, JQ, buddy, if you make me the Secretary of State, because at this point, the Secretary of State is kind of like the on bench or on deck circle for the presidency. Okay? John Adams was Secretary of State. James Madison was Secretary of State before becoming president. James Monroe was Secretary of State before becoming president. And so Clay figures, if you make me Secretary of State, I'm the heir apparent to the presidency. Henry Clay, as we know, favors a very strong national government, and we'll see that play out again and again. Okay, so they make this backroom deal, and it screws Jackson out of the presidency, because Clay will now put his votes, and Crawford will go along with Clay and put his votes behind Adams, and Adams will go into the presidency. Okay, the problem with this is one of the things the Republican Party was getting accused of was, over time, over this 20-year period in power, becoming elitist, okay, ignoring, so to speak, the will of the people. Well, this is a backroom political deal. This is the kind of elite corruption that the Republicans are being criticized for. Jackson himself will go ballistic over this and challenge it on a constitutional basis, and of course, on a constitutional basis, he has no leg to stand on. Okay, and one of the things we'll find in Jackson's presidency, okay, is from this moment forward, Jackson will make it his mission in life to destroy Henry Clay. Okay, and we'll talk about this more when we get to Jackson. Jackson had very little to do with public policy. His presidency is all about personal vendetta and personal power and prestige. He will use the office of president to screw Henry Clay and another guy, John C. Calhoun, every possible chance he gets. And so this sets up the challenge, and what I refer to it here is Henry Clay's coup. And in exchange for Clay's support as Speaker of House, John Quincy Adams will make him Secretary of State. This forms up the National Republican Party. They are elitist, they are nationalist, and that's all that I've been getting at with the corruption of the 1824 election. And I'll make reference to it again briefly when Jackson actually is elected in the 1828 election. But at any rate, that finally ends the three-part epic that is the Republican era. I suspect we're going to have a three-part epic on the Democratic era too. But that ends the Republican era, and PowerPoint Lecture 2.2, Part C.